Welcome to Nasdaq Trade Talks. I'm Jill Malandrino, Global Markets Reporter at Nasdaq. Joining me is Options Play Chief Strategist Tony Zhang to discuss Nordic options market and some strategies to trade the trends. Tony, it's great to have you with us as always. Thanks so much for joining me on Trade Talks.
Thank you so much for having me back.
All right, and Tony, let's go through the four major markets that you're taking a look at. Run us through the charts here.
Yeah, so I was on 3 weeks ago and markets were in a pretty different state back then, but things are much healthier, as you can see, not just in the Nordic regions, but across the US. No matter how you kind of slice and dice this market right now, whether you look at equal weight versus market cap, small cap versus large cap, growth versus value, we're seeing rotation pretty much everywhere. And this is supportive of the markets moving, continuing higher. And this is exactly what we see across the Nordic markets. So to take a look at that, let's first start off with looking at the Stockholm S30 index. So what's amazing about this index is that it's managed to break back above 1700, which is a pretty phenomenal level for it to get back above. So it's very bullish right now. And we had a recent pullback here over the last few trading periods. And I think this provides a good opportunity actually to go long with a pretty good risk to reward here on the Stockholm market. So Stockholm looking significantly stronger than it did a couple of weeks ago. Next, I want to take a look at Copenhagen. This is by far the strongest market of the Nordic markets. It's within 50 points of its all-time highs. Similar to the Nasdaq 100 index, it is slowly making its way higher. What I really like, or what's very constructive about this chart, is that the move higher has actually been a very steady climb. It's not moving sideways for a little bit and then going parabolic like some of the other charts. It's a very steady climb, and I think this type of market is likely going to continue grinding higher, reach that all-time high, and potentially break out even beyond that, just like the Nasdaq 100 has done over the last couple of days. The next one we want to take a look at is the Oslo. This was actually the weakest of the Nordic markets, but it's really recently reclaimed the 200-week moving average and the 20-week moving average, which puts it much more in a bullish trend as we did versus a few weeks ago. The indicators here aren't particularly overbought, so this certainly has some room up to run to the next resistance level around 820. And then lastly, rounding out the Nordic markets, we have Helsinki, which really has come back to life over the past few weeks and has gained quite a bit of relative strength. And this is, out of the four markets, the one that's actually most overbought. So on this particular market, I think there's a fairly limited upside here, but in my opinion, this is still the type of market, it's still very bullish. You want to buy the dips and target roughly about 4,200 on the upside here for Helsinki. So if you wrap up all four markets, all the markets currently are joining in on this rally, which again is healthy for the markets to continue moving higher. We've seen some consolidation over the past few days, which also is healthy for the markets to continue moving higher. But there is a higher probability of a small correction here as markets start to reach these type of overbought conditions. So right now, to position for this market, the goal here is really to minimize your risk by looking for trades with good risk to reward ratios from a stock perspective, and then overlay option strategies that really allow you to minimize your risk on these types of trades. So those are the trades that I want to explore with you guys here today.
Tony, before we get into your first trade, I just have a question. So we know that the Nasdaq 100 has been the relative American major average outperformer because of its exposure to technology. You had also said that Copenhagen, Helsinki, with making a comeback, or one of those indexes more technology heavy? Does another one have more financial or energy exposure, which has been weaker? Are they very different, like the composure of the Nasdaq 100 relative to the other major averages here?
Yes, they are. Generally speaking, Oslo is far more oil and mining heavy, much more energy heavy. So that's why they were quite weak for a while. So it's really the Stockholm 30 index that has the most technology names, and it has come back to life quite a bit over the last couple of weeks. Denmark also fair amount of technology names in those particular indices. One of the things that really led to the outperformance of the Nasdaq 100 index is also the lack of financials in it. Financials was quite weak until just a couple of weeks ago, and that really led to a lot of that outperformance.
All right, Tony, let's get into your first strategy here. And we're taking a look at a defensive strategy in the pharmaceutical sector.
Yeah, I want to take a look at AstraZeneca because, first of all, if you look at the chart, what's really constructive here is the fact that it broke above a 990 level back here in April. rallied, but then came back to retest that 990 level as support. So from a risk to reward perspective, I think you have a great risk to reward for a long trade, but I want to reduce our risk even further by utilizing strategies using options such as a debit vertical spread, which really allow us to maximize our potential upside exposure while doing so in a way with minimizing the amount of risk that's on the card. So the trade that I want to look at here is going out to August, about 72 days from expiration, buying the 990, which are the at the money calls, selling the 1125 calls against it, which is roughly one standard deviation out. Now, this trade currently costs about 45 crowns or 4,500 crowns for the contract. And what I'm looking here is for a breakout or a retest of that 990 support and for the stock to rally up to that 1080 level. If that happens, I'm only risking about 4.5% of the underlying stock price to take this bullish view. And if the stock does rally up to that 1120 strike or so, I'm looking at about a 2-to-1 risk to reward ratio on my trade. But most importantly, I'm only risking 4.5% of the underlying stock price, even if the stock completely falls apart and falls back down to 800 level, which is where it was just trading a couple of months ago. I'm only risking 4.5% of the underlying stock price.
All right, your next strategy here, taking a look at security.
Yeah, security. This is definitely one of the buzzwords, if you will, post-COVID-19. And this stock I really like because it really formed quite a bit of a base since March here between that 150, 200 crown level. And it just broke out from that 200 level last week. And it's starting to retest that level as support. So again, from a chart perspective, very similar setup. Great risk to reward, and we're just going to increase that a little bit by using an option strategy. Same type of option strategy, a call debit spread where I'm going out to August and I'm buying the 195 230 call spread, buying the at the money calls and selling the 230 calls that are roughly one standard deviation away for about 12 crowns here. So I'm risking 6% of the underlying stock price to take a bullish view here on this particular stock as it bounces off that 200 support and move towards that next resistance, which is around the 235, 236 level. If it does reach that level, I'm looking at about 1.5, 1.6 times risk versus reward on this particular trade.
All right, Tony, we know how to find you in the States. How can we find you in the Nordic market?
Yeah, so we have a fantastic partnership with Nasdaq in the Nordics to give all Nordic investors completely free access to the Options Play platform, which gives you access to online education, weekly income opportunity reports, as well as market outlook sessions like we do here, just an extended version of that for all Nordic investors. And you can sign up for that just at optionsplay.se.
All right, Tony, great stuff as always. Thanks so much for joining me on Trade Talks.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right, and thanks for joining us. I'm Jill Malandrino, Global Markets Reporter at Nasdaq.